I have never given a paper before. And I was tempted to just throw away the paper and talk to you. But that wouldn't have been the paper that I wrote. So before I say some of the things from the paper, I'm going to start with something that isn't in my paper, but that I think is the most urgent, pressing matter, certainly in my life and in a lot of women's lives, and that's the issue of motherhood. And what I want to say about that is motherhood is severely undervalued in this culture. Many mothers live in loneliness, isolation, and neurosis in solitary houses, stuck in apartment buildings where they don't know their neighbors, where they're miles away from their relatives, and they have nothing to turn to except when their husband comes home from work. They're trying to raise these children. They probably have not had enough education because it is assumed that if you are a mother, you don't need an education. That assumption can be traced at least from the 19th century, where it was thought that it was as if the Almighty had created a uterus and built up a woman's body around it. That's a quotation I read from a physician's manual of the 19th century. And it was believed that a human being had a brain, and a woman also has the uterus, which produces the next generation. And you couldn't pay attention to both. There's limited energy available. So in the woman, if you educated her mind, it was at the expense of her child-rearing capacities. She would produce weak children if she had a strong mind. So we may think that we have outgrown that in our times, but I don't think we have. We still, in the majority of people's homes in Canada, it is still believed that you don't need university if you're just going to get married and raise kids. It was with great shock that I one day opened a book where Abdu'l-Baha wrote that motherhood is a great station, a great calling, and that in fact it requires the highest of education. If we had educated mothers, we would change the world in one generation. In this paper, I was interested in the role that women play in establishing world peace. Basically, what my paper says is there are two value systems. There's one that has been in existence since at least 1300 BC, when apparently tribes with patriarchal values overtook the existing tribes in the Levant area all around the Mediterranean. And the matriarchies at that time revered women as the life givers. New life came through women, and life at that time had a higher value than it does now. There were many more deaths than there are now. There were goddesses, the goddesses of life and of death and of fecundity, the goddesses that created new food growing out of the earth. There's the corn goddesses. Women were seen to be somehow connected with life and death and all manner of birth and growth. And then around 1300 BC, these patriarchies took over, and at that time, the values that are in our present society were laid down. And the patriarchal values are conquest of the earth, domination of the earth and of women, because women were seen to be inferior. The earth was seen to be inferior. The things that were superior was God and man together. That man is the man apart from women, not the man that means both. God and man, and logic, reason, was at the top. And the inferior level was women and the earth and emotions. Women were seen as irrational, chaotic creatures. And I even think of the myth of Adam and Eve as the last attempt to cover up female power. The one thing men could not, the one thing that this male value system could not take away from women was the fact that new life came through the woman's body. And so the myth of Adam and Eve tells how the first woman came through man. Now, I'm going to start with my real paper here and whip through it. Aristotle said, we talk about how it's time to change our attitudes. These attitudes have been with us a long time. And when I say the male value system, I don't mean all you men out there. I mean, it's a system of values that has been identified with men because, face it, who's been in power? Really? And the female value system, or the feminine value system, is the complementary system. But in fact, most people haven't even noticed yet that there is a feminine value system, because feminine values have been seen as weaknesses. Aristotle said, the female is a female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities. Not over yet. We should regard the female nature as afflicted with a natural defectiveness. The Bible gives spiritual authority to this notion. These are two quotations, one's from Timothy and the other's from Colossians. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Sigmund Freud gives the whole notion scientific veracity when he says that the woman is an unfinished man. Unfortunately, many people believed him, women included. In fact, I think he built up his practice over neurotic women who were suffering from their lack. Psychologists such as Erik Erikson and Talcott Parsons and somebody named Bacon, whose first name I don't know, were studying gender differences in our time. It's become a hot issue these days. And they claim that males, and here they've done studies on men and women, and they've discovered all these values that men really have, and all these other values that women really have. So what they've discovered is that men, whether acquired or innate, have a capacity to be public. It's easier for a man to be autonomous, independent, cut away from the things around him, stand on his own 2 feet, and speak and do and cut paths and cut channels and cut down trees and use his sword and use his gun and use his bomb and whatever, while women have an orientation which is private, expressive, and communal. The woman's concern is for the group. The man's concern is for his individual identity. Now, don't attack me personally for these. They are documented in books written by other people. There's an interesting psychologist named Carol Gilligan who works at Harvard University, and she's done many tests on women using her own, forget that thought, it didn't go anywhere. Anyway, she has discovered through these tests, she has designed them specifically using women's frameworks. She's discovered that there are frameworks that women are used to thinking in, frameworks that men are used to thinking in. And she's found that women have an overriding concern with relationships and responsibilities to other people. Thus, one might say that While men have a stronger individual identity, women possess a stronger social identity. Men think in terms of themselves, and women think in terms of the group. These are just generalizations, but they're useful when we're talking about these two value systems. Oh, it's funny because in popular songs, this theme keeps coming up of the patriarchal value system where I've got to be me and I'll do it my way. And, do your own thing and all this. This is from the patriarchal value system, which values the individual developing at the expense of those around. So these stereotypes reflect a conception of maturity which is identified with the male values. If you are going to be mature, you have to be autonomous and independent. Where does that leave the women? Well, weak, unfinished. Now we're starting to look at women's values and discover, they actually value intimacy. Women value connection. And these are the important elements that the world is lacking right now. The world is out of balance, favoring the separateness of the individual self over connection to others. The world could be likened to a body with no soul, a brain with no heart, logic with no feeling, individual without community, and science without mercy. The earth is ill. The remedy is to bring feminine values into balance with masculine values. Now, what I did here was find in the world some real people or groups that exemplified the male value system and a real group that exemplified the female value system, and it was not hard to find. I used United States administration and the Soviet Union. The administration of those two countries are perfect examples of how patriarchal values work. And for the feminine values, I discovered the Greenham Common Women's Peace Group. These groups are very different in their numbers. There might be 30,000 women in the peace group at one time, and only 2 men in the other group, but they are alike where they talk about peace. They agree that peace is the most important issue of our time. So, let's see how they talk about it. Now I'm going to have to leave out a few of my precious pages. I looked at the Geneva peace talks. The single most distinguishing feature of the peace talks is their obsession with weapons. When asked what was foremost on the agenda, U.S. President Ronald Reagan replied, peace. Yet the peace proposal, as printed in the New York Times, was an inventory of all existing varieties of nuclear weapons, with a proposed allotment for each side. In 1959, Nikita Khrushchev, who was president of the Soviet Union at that time, and U.S. President Eisenhower agreed that disarmament is the world's main problem. I bet you think disarmament means doing away with weapons. Well, I looked it up in the dictionary, and much to my surprise, it also means just reducing the weapons. So all those years that we thought leaders were talking about abolishing nuclear weapons, they are really only discussing reducing them. And in fact, nobody uses the word disarmament anymore. It's arms control or arms limitation. Nuclear weapons have somehow become socially acceptable. Carol Gilligan observes that men and women make moral judgments from different perspectives. Men approach a moral judgment by surrounding it with rules. Women ask themselves what personal response would be appropriate. And we see this illustrated with these two groups about peace. U.S. President Ronald Reagan feels he can eliminate the nuclear threat by surrounding it with rules. And so their peace proposal for the Geneva summit was 1,250 to 1,450 intercontinental ballistic missiles for each side, 350 long-range bombers for each side, 4,500 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and sea-launched ballistic missile warheads for each side, etc., etc. 1,500 air-launched cruise missiles for each side, and 3,000 ICBM warheads for each side. The Soviets had a simpler solution. 6,000 missiles and bombers for each side, 3,600 intercontinental ballistic missile warheads, and a ban on Star Wars. The language itself is powerful, aggressive, antagonistic. Yet, the assumption is that nuclear weapons can be made safe by dividing them equally, as little boys do with snowballs. Compare this with a statement issued by the Greenham Common women. As women, we wish to protect all life on this planet. We will not allow the war games, which allegedly protect some while killing others, and lead to nuclear war, which will kill us all. The men are focusing on weapons and the women on life. The women display a loyalty to the planet and its people, while the men seek to dominate and manipulate the earth. Now, this may be offensive to some of you men, because I know that there are many men who love the planet and its people and are working in peace groups and other kinds of groups to achieve peace on earth. I just have to talk in these terms to keep it straight what we're talking about. Star Wars is an interesting development in the light of patriarchal values. In the ancient patriarchal myths, God was in the sky or on the mountaintop, separate from his creation, far above it, and dominating. So I found this great quote by Soviet Premier Gorbachev. He's talking about Star Wars, and he says, one could quote President Johnson way back, who said that whoever manages to gain power in space will rule the earth. And they're just itching to get their hands into it. He said, they're just itching to get this world domination and look down on the world from on high. It's an old, long-standing ambition. So, world domination from space would be the ultimate patriarchal power play, the return of Zeus, perhaps. Is this the hidden agenda of these guys? If it is, they disguise it with this concern for peace. President Reagan believes that Star Wars is a tool which will bring peace about, and he says, if our research succeeds, it will bring much closer the safer, more stable world we seek. Nations could defend themselves against missile attack, and mankind at long last escape the prison of mutual terror, and this is my dream. The Greenham Common women and other women's peace groups around the world believe that it is these attempts to establish peace through weapons which create the prison of mutual terror. In the words of Fiona Cooper, one of the Greenham Common women, the patriarchs are trying now to out-threaten each other, and the protection they are promising us only increases our fears. And in any case, the assumptions behind the superpowers is that nations will always have enemies and always be subject to missile attack from other nations. Alienation, like nuclear weapons, is an accepted part of the system and is built right into the system. Here is the Nordic Manifesto, which is a peace statement by a coalition of European women's peace groups. Women all over the world nourish the same thoughts and the same fears. Do my children have any future? Together with women all over the world, we want to turn our powerlessness to strength. No longer can we accept silently the power game between the superpowers. All acts of aggression must be stopped, and the disarmament negotiations must be continued and must lead to action and disarmament. We demand disarmament to secure lasting peace, food instead of arms, no to war. And this is something from Julia Ward Howe, who was an American feminist and pacifist. She wrote this in 1870. Arise, all women who have hearts. Say firmly, we women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to injure theirs. In the name of womanhood and humanity, I earnestly ask that a General Congress of Women, without limit of nationality, promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace. I can tell I've said too much. But we see a collective consciousness in all these women's peace groups. A consciousness of the earth, a concern for our children, a concern for all people. The woman's priorities, as seen by these documents, are the caring and nurturing of all people. The women see no enemies, only mouths to feed and the human family to care for. They are asking for connection, affiliation, alliance. Now, back to the boys. The New York Times printed a report of the Geneva Summit as if it were a contest rather than an attempt at mutual understanding. This is just sort of, I guess I probably don't need to show you this, but it's how almost it's like the world is promoting how nasty can you get without creating the Third World War. The headline in the New York Times read, Summit Finale, Keeping Score, Winners and Losers. And then they said it was a victory for President Reagan and a setback for Mikhail Gorbachev. Can mutual understanding be possible in this atmosphere? These words create alienation rather than reconciliation. And Gorbachev appears to have grown weary of the contest. He said after the summit, we must go away from confrontation into a more healthy way of solving problems. Through united efforts, I am convinced that the old approaches will take us no further. He sees that the system is not working, but he doesn't have any solutions. Of course, Baha'is have the solutions, but no one's asking them yet. It is interesting to study the language surrounding the nuclear arms race. The term first strike suggests that you get to hurt somebody before they hurt you. Window of vulnerability suggests the extent to which either side is willing to be open to the other. In other words, not at all. And then there are lovely terms like warhead, overkill, mega death, and cruise missile. People who invent these words cannot be thinking of their children or their brothers or their sisters or their parents or their wives, any or all of whom would be probably counted among the mega deaths of a first strike. We call the United States and the Soviet Union superpowers. In giving them these high-impact names, are we unwittingly granting them permission to rule the world? Well, the women's peace groups are challenging these assumptions. I'm going to talk about the Greenham Common Women for a minute. Their operative word is nonviolence. They design and carry out ingenious and imaginative actions. And in doing so, they hope to create alternatives to the present way of thinking. Each woman in the group has made a personal commitment to Greenham through intense suffering over the threat of nuclear war. Fear is the starting point, writes one. And given the dreadful potential of nuclear weapons, it is absolutely reasonable to be afraid. They feel that women particularly are recognizing that the only hope we have of reversing this terrifying situation is to withdraw our support from a system which in no way deserves our cooperation or respect. I think motherhood plays an important role in the way women are responding to the peace issue. So I'm going to talk about motherhood again in another context. For many women, the focus of their anguish has been their children. One woman says, children are much more susceptible to radiation than adults. I would have to watch them die in agony and then die myself. Suddenly it became obvious to me that I had to do something for my children. As mothers, women have a direct biological and spiritual commitment to the human race. Here is an account which highlights this connection. It's written by, it was in a book that Carl Jung and somebody named Karenyi wrote, and it's called The Abyssinian Woman. I assume she was a real person who they interviewed. And this is what she said. The woman conceives. As a mother, she is another person than the woman without child. She carries the fruit of the night for 9 months in her body. Something grows into her life that never again departs from it. She is a mother. She is and remains a mother, even though her children die. All her children die. For at one time she carried the child under her heart, and it does not go out of her heart ever again, not even when it is dead. All this the man does not know. A mother thinks communally rather than individually because of her children. In modern times, the community is the human race. The ancient link between women and the earth emerges in women's peace movements as a grave concern for the earth and all its creatures. No one will change this disastrous course for us. We must do it ourselves. We must prove there are other ways of organizing which do not depend on violence. By acknowledging that each person is responsible in their own way for the world in which we live. And Dr. Helen Caldecott writes, we are the curators of every organism on earth. The Greenham women view nuclear weapons as symptoms of a greater disease having to do with our assumptions about human nature. We assume, for instance, that power means dominance. People are used to thinking that power comes from independence, standing alone, controlling other people, depriving other people, from other people's dependence and acquiescence. But there is an alternate view of power. We're all dependent on each other's knowledge and skill. Power partly derives from our relationships with each other and recognizing our mutual dependence. Thus, there is power in connection. Another assumption they challenge concerns violence. People assume that violence is a central part of human nature. People equate anger with violence. Yet, many Greenham women are very angry, particularly at the squandering of resources on weapons of mass destruction. But they do not express it in violent ways. Rather, they channel it into creative opposition. Now, one day, for example, March the 8th, which is International Women's Day, they handed out peace pies in the streets of London, England. They made a whole bunch of these pies, and each one had a flag stuck in it with a little message about peace written on it. And one woman dressed up as a waitress and served a cardboard cruise missile to people passing by. No one bought it. Now, the Manchester Guardian thought this was all very humorous, and it was, but it achieved its object, which was to meet as many people as possible and discuss the issue. So, we think that confrontation means two forces opposing each other, but their method of confrontation was confrontation by connecting with people. Okay, time to go. So I'm going to skip all the rest of it and go to the end, which is to propose this. A new relation to the woman principle is urgently needed today to counteract the one-sidedness of the prevailing mode of Western civilization. You see that the prevailing values on competition, on logic over emotion, on standing alone instead of connecting with other people, have created this monstrous technological dragon which has brought us to the brink of possible destruction. It's like the individual personality grows like a tree, And as the branches grow and the twigs grow and the tiny, tiny twigs and the leaves and all these separate individual parts grow, this is the first half of life. The greatest degree of individuation has now occurred on earth. This is my personal feeling. And now the second half, which is the spiritual half, begins. And that's the integration. There's all these twigs and branches. There's all these nations, all these peoples, and all these individuals in the world shrieking, I am who I am. And they don't know each other. It's the feminine principles which connect and unite. And that's really what I came here to say. So, in mythical terms, Eve is offering Adam another apple.
I feel if I had a shred of genuine femininity left in my body, I would sing you a lullaby and send you to bed. You've listened long and patiently. The title of these remarks is From Oppression to Peace, from the research of historians and of anthropologists from science, that the past of the human race has been oppression for women, that because of the physical strength of men, men have dominated over women. This is the universally recognized fact. And we know also that in this generation, there is a planet-wide call for equality between men and women. In the Baha'i writings, we know that it's the will of God that men and women shall be equal, and that the world will live in peace. Therefore, we must move from all the cultures for all the centuries, all the manners, all the modes of thought which have expressed oppression. We must move to equality between men and women and to peace on this earth. We are all involved. Not one of us can be a man or a woman in the mode of the past. The past has never expressed equality. Each of us, therefore, is involved in this change. We can do it well or poorly, but we cannot escape it. The Universal House of Justice, that supreme institution of the Baha'i world community, has called upon the peoples of the world to take an evolutionary step. Dr. Laszlo explained to us that the steps of evolution, when they reach the level of humanity, become conscious choice. The House of Justice has said to the peoples of the world, there will be peace. Yours is the choice of whether that peace will come after unimaginable horrors or sooner through enlightenment, sparing humankind those horrors. Half of the peoples of the earth to whom that message is addressed are women. And tonight, I would like to consider with you how we will answer. This is not an easy question. No group of human beings in the history of the earth have taken the step from oppression to peace. There has never been peace, and yet we are invited to do so. in this message, the House of Justice tells us that peace will not be accomplished by nuclear treaties, by this approach. No, there are 7 basic issues of injustice, which are the root causes of war, and without the resolution of which there can be no peace. I would like to suggest to you that the oppression women have experienced in these centuries and cultures based on oppression, that oppression makes them particularly able to solve and understand each of these 7 issues called the root causes of war. First of all, we have racism. Racism is the definition of another group of people as objects on the basis of race. They are to be used and exploited. Do not women know the meaning of being objects? Have we not been bought and sold? Have we not been taught to make ourselves appealing, to save our pennies to buy that cosmetic which will make us lovable and appealing? I think we know what it is like to lose our humanity and become objects whose labor may be exploited. The second issue is the great gap between the rich and the poor. And we have statistics. 2/3 of the work in the world is done by women. 1/10 of the income of the world goes to women. 1/100 of the wealth of the world belongs to women. I think, therefore, we know about the gap between the rich and the poor. Those statistics are a bit abstract. When I think of that issue, I think of the women of Zimbabwe who are forbidden to themselves decide which crop they should grow. If their husband is away on vacation, they may plant nothing until he decides whether it should be corn or potatoes. I think of the development projects in Africa in which millions of dollars have been spent on agricultural research, the outcome of which has disappointed the donors. And why? Land was divided in Africa between the man and the woman. The man would grow a crop for which he received cash, something to be sold. The woman grew the crops which were to feed the family. When the development schemes came, they educated the man, taught him to irrigate or fertilize or use a different kind of hoe. He was therefore able to do more. He took part of his wife's land and planted it in a cash crop. She had a smaller piece to plant to feed the family. And what did the rural African man do with more cash? The only thing he had learned to do, he bought beer. The outcome of the development program was an increase in malnutrition for women and children and alcoholism for men. The third issue is nationalism. What is nationalism except a collectively bloated ego? An ego which must be the best, which must dominate, and which must compete. I ask you, women, if you are familiar with bloated egos. With egos which must win on small points in order to prove their adequacy. Do we know about competition? If we are excluded from power, we are reduced to envious, competitors to gain the favor of the powerful. That is another indignity of women. Religious strife is number 4. We heard from Nancy about the prejudices against women in religious communities. There is no religious institution prior to the Baha'i faith where women have been recognized. The Muslim clergy debated whether women had souls. Witches have been burned. I think women know well what it is to be left out of people's prayers. Number 5, the emancipation of women. The Universal House of Justice said we must have equality between men and women, or men will leave the home, will leave the arena of the family with harmful habits which they will take to the workplace, the community, and the international level of human society. What habits? If the man dominates in the home, what habit is he learning? What habit that he will take out to society? He is learning that strength makes right or wrong, that physical strength determines decisions. He is learning oppression. In the Baha'i order, in any peaceful order, strength is the servant of justice. Strength is the protector of the weak. Unless we have equality of men and women in the home, men don't know how to think with justice. Number 6, education is necessary for peace. Ignorance is an impediment. I believe women know ignorance very well. We have been socialized to believe that our value exists in the eyes of another. Our value is measured in our desirability. We have been taught to gain self-respect by winning approval. We have served the false god of external acceptance. Our psychologically greatest weakness is our readiness to sacrifice justice in order to be loved. This is ignorance, and we long to learn to see with our own eyes, to hear with our own ears, to respect ourselves on a basis different from someone else's approval. Language. We are to have a universal auxiliary language so that the peoples of the world may understand one another. I believe women know what it is to live in a world which speaks a foreign language, in which their experience cannot be expressed. Nancy has spoken of the dialogue of disarmament, of megatons, of a strategic defense initiative, of a preventive strike, of an electromagnetic pulse. This is the language of peace. So we know the flavor, the taste, and the tragedy of oppression in each of these 7 issues. Now we are called upon to do something. We are told, Abdu'l-Baha wrote, that there will not be peace in the world until women arise, till they raise their voices in the parliaments of the world, until they vote, until they work, until they exert an effort in the name of peace. And so if we know our past, as Dr. Laszlo said we may in the course of evolution, and we recognize in that past oppression, our challenge is to use that past in order to make this next step in evolution, the achievement of peace, to do something humanity has never done before. The reactions to oppression, the natural human reactions to oppression, are not pretty. The results of oppression are not pleasant. In the Nazi concentration camps, where oppression was seen in a vivid extreme, we saw the results. The Nazi guards were embodiments of total power. And among the Jewish prisoners, there were two observable reactions. Some of these prisoners, terrified, frightened, began to walk with a goose step, to click their heels together, to mimic those guards who held life and death power over them. Other Jewish prisoners were reduced to a degraded servility, running to get them water, eager to dust off their shoes. These prisoners showed us all the face of oppression. And the women of the world will fail to step forward in evolution if we too goose step, if we are seduced by the symbols of power and excitement, if we rush in to also serve in the arenas of finance and government and ecclesiastical institutions bewitched by its power. You can read articles now of how to be a successful businesswoman. Wear a pinstripe suit. Think like a man. That's surrender to the aggressor. So too we will fail if we flatter and serve and bow and scrape and in the name of unity or in the name of peacefulness behave without self-respect. Those are natural reactions to oppression, the death of self. There is another one. It is to engage in a power struggle. And we can see the signs of power struggle about pronouns, about salaries, and about rights in the home. A power struggle is also surrender. It's a surrender to the past, to the animal level of existence. It has no transcendence within it. Well, what then must we do if we are to move from oppression to peace? The shift in the world that is necessary to achieve peace is a shift of consciousness. It is to see oneness in humanity. It is to transcend power struggle. And I think that we are called upon to become the vehicles of a kind of divine photosynthesis. You know what happens with the plant when it wants to lift the mineral to a higher level of existence? The leaves open and they receive the light of the sun. And it is the light of the sun that enables them to pull with their roots a material and raise it to a higher plane of existence. Peace is only humanly possible if we open our souls to the light of spiritual energy, to the words of Baha'u'llah. We have to be transformed within ourselves in order to be ready to associate in the new human forms, which are the institutions of peace. The women of the world, therefore, have this choice. They can remain as victims of oppression, bewailing their plight, feeling self-pity or rage. Or they can perform a transformation, which in the terms of science might be called a chemical change, an alchemy. In the terms of religion, that is called a sacrifice. That is the process by which a base metal, like iron, cold and hard and black, changes itself in the heat of suffering to become luminous, hot, and fluid. The House of Justice is asking women to make a sacrifice. To sacrifice their timidity, their imitation of the aggressor, their servility to a kind of spiritual dignity. We are called upon to be women. Women, as Nancy told us, who are different from men, who speak a language of spiritual truth. We are asked to inject into the dialogue of megatons and Star Wars and body counts a personal truth. That personal truth is simple. War must cease. No ideology, no economic theory, no set of political prejudices justifies the death of one child in war, whether that child is Russian, American, Afghanistani, Nicaraguan. The world waits for the voice of women to emerge from timidity and from domestic concerns to protect the children of the world. We are compassionate by nature, and we are summoned to express strength in our compassion, a strength that can forgive the aggressiveness and brutality of the past, born of fear. The opposite of oppression is empowerment. Baha'u'llah has empowered humanity. Particularly, he has empowered women. He says, "Step forth from thy chamber, O maid of heaven. Drape thyself in whatever manner pleaseth thee, in the silken vestures of immortality." The language Baha'u'llah speaks calls forth the feminine principle. We are asked to step forth from oppression, to step forth from our past, and to enter a new realm of spiritual consciousness. And what of our past? Shall we dwell on it and bewail our plight? In the fire tablet, Baha'u'llah writes, "We have made abasement the garment of glory, and affliction the adornment of thy temple." This is a statement of religious truth and of scientific truth. The affliction of the past, the abasement of women, should they be attracted to spiritual growth, to the sun of Baha'u'llah's revelation, gives them the humility, the pain, the powerlessness, and the longing to cry out for his strength, to be empowered, to speak a spiritual truth, a personal truth, not only with words, with actions, with deeds, in the process of consultation. And if we do this, we will find that our oppression has been a blessing. It has enabled us to see the reality of each of these 7 issues mentioned in the peace message. And you know, if you think of the past as a time of oppression, of domination and subjection, which would you rather be, the bully or the victim? I'm not sorry to have been of the people who were victims. And so I say, let us accept the blessing of our oppression and step forward and become the vehicles of the achievement of peace.